All right, it is 2:01. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for coming today, and let's jump in. My name is Savannah Tracy. I'm the Communications Manager at the Cleveland Water Alliance, and we're just really excited to be partnering with Limno Tech, Green Eyes, Eco, and all the rest of you to bring this webinar today about some exciting smart technology that is being used in the Great Lakes and beyond. Throughout the presentation, I want to encourage you to submit questions. We'll be allowing about 10 minutes at the end of the presentation to answer your questions, but please submit questions throughout as they arise throughout the presentation, and then we'll just address those at the end. So before we kick off, I'm just going to take a brief moment to talk about the Cleveland Water Alliance for those of you who don't have much background on us. So the Cleveland Water Alliance is a nonprofit, and we collaborate with a cross-sector of partners to really accelerate implementation and commercialization of tech in the water space. Our mission is to foster a robust water innovation and technology ecosystem of economic development and commercialization through partnerships and collaborations, while still preserving and protecting our water resources. While we're a water innovation cluster based in Northeast Ohio, we work across Lake Erie and the Great Lakes region. So at the Cleveland Water Alliance, we recognize that water is one of Northeast Ohio's and the Great Lakes region's most valuable and often undervalued assets. But getting smarter about this protection and use will serve the region for years to come. So we value and focus on a variety of programming, but since today is about smart technologies, I'm going to talk a little bit about our Smart Lake Erie initiative. So since 2017, Cleveland Water Alliance has been focusing on building a vision for Smart Lake Erie. And this is a new breed of smart and connected infrastructure that enables intelligent regional water management through a cross-sector collaboration of institutions and communities. We see Lake Erie as a test bed, ideal for piloting technology that can be used all across the Great Lakes and ultimately to water bodies around the globe. And the Smart Lake Erie initiative is closely linked with the Smart Great Lakes initiative, which works to build an informational ecosystem based on smart technologies that improve understanding, use, and management of all of the Great Lakes. So this initiative is co-led by Great Lakes Observing System, or GLOS, the Cleveland Water Alliance, and the Council of the Great Lakes region. And in this, Cleveland Water Alliance hopes to expand the systems and technologies that we're testing in Smart Lake Erie to the broader Great Lakes. So that was just a really brief overview. Stay tuned for more information on that. But I also wanted to just take a quick moment to plug another upcoming related webinar for the Great Lakes HABS Collaborative happening next Friday, the 28th, on Smart Watersheds for Smart Lake Management. This should be a really great webinar with the themes that continue the conversation that we'll be having here today. So if you're interested, you can find out more information on this link listed here, and we'll also send out a link after this webinar for a link on this webinar and also this link. So that brings me to today's webinar. We're really excited to have a great lineup of technologies to share with you today that are already being used in the Great Lakes and beyond. I think we're going to have Ed Verhamme from Limno Tech up first, then Vince Kelly of Green Eyes, Alicia Ritzenthaler of Limno Tech, and John Higley of Eco after that. So I'll remind you once again to please submit your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll be taking Q&A at the end, so stick around for a few minutes if you can. This, as I mentioned, this webinar will also be recorded and then sent out via email afterwards, so you can review it or send it to people that might be interested. All right, with that, Ed, I'm going to let you take it away.
Great, thanks Savannah. Today I wanted to talk about a next generation wireless sensor network for the Great Lakes. This presentation is a collection of work that we've been doing in the last year, and we'll really be jumping headfirst into in the next year. And it's kind of an opportunity to touch on technology as it relates to how do we get researchers working together, how do we use new technology that's on the shelf, and how do we sort of blend some of the old and new technologies together, and I'll be sort of finishing with how you can get involved. So next slide. Just as a refresher for folks not familiar with Limno Tech, well, Limno Tech is a large environmental consulting company based in the Great Lakes here. I focus most of my work on monitoring projects across the Great Lakes, and so within the last year, we've supported 30 critical real-time stations in the Great Lakes for cities, water and power plants, and universities. These stations have generated about 20 million data points this last year alone, monitoring water temperatures, wind speeds, wave heights. We share this data in real time with NOAA, the Great Lakes Observing System. There's about 350,000 individual users which have accessed our real-time data, most from our weather buoys on Lake Michigan, monitoring waves. And I put a list of all the partners that we've worked with to deploy real-time stations. So, we have a lot of experience with sort of master research stations. We're monitoring a lot of parameters at one station. All of these stations that we deploy have cell modems. And we've kind of evolved our use of this technology over the last decade. And it's reached a critical point in terms of coordinating with other organizations and agencies, and has really led us to lead into this next wireless technology. So I think you'll see the list of organizations there is pretty broad, from individual cities, villages, townships to city of Cleveland, Toledo. So one thing that technology allows us to do is to really cut down the cost and expense of servicing and deploying equipment for a range of organizations. Next slide. So why is a new wireless sensor network needed for the region? One thing that was sort of hard to convey without just putting these words out here is there's been an exponential increase in the number of stations deployed. I mentioned LimnoTech's been deploying about 24 stations across the Great Lakes. There's about 75 real-time buoys and weather stations on the Great Lakes right now. If we were to look 5 years ago, there would only be about 10 or so stations. We're also finding that industry is demanding real-time access to data. So after the Toledo water crisis, for example, getting access to lake conditions near water intakes has been a critical need. So getting data early and getting it in real time is really driving a lot of technology advances on the Great Lakes. Cellular technologies are also changing pretty rapidly. If folks aren't familiar with the transition from the 2G network to the 3G network to now the 4G, and on the horizon is the 5G network, that cellular data networks have really changed how scientists send and transmit data. And being co-developed along this are low power wide area networks, or LPWANs. These low power wireless networks are being used in smart cities, cars. A lot of folks probably have smart meters at their house. And so these, how we move and send environmental data is changing. And so, this is why we need to take a new look at what's available for wireless sensor technology. Next slide. If we look just at Lake Erie in 2019, these are all the water quality stations that I could inventory that are collecting data in Lake Erie. And it's almost 300 stations and instruments are out in the lake right now. If we were to look 7 years ago, there might have only been 4 or 5 dots on this map, which correspond to some historical NOAA weather buoys. Not all of these stations are real time, but again, it's been surprising to me just how many more organizations are monitoring conditions, and can we use a common technology backbone to share data across these organizations. Next slide. If you could click, thank you. If you look at just the stations that are real time, that's the ones on this map right now. And we can start to see clusters of stations. So if you look near Toledo, near Sandusky, and near Cleveland, we start getting a critical density of these real-time stations where we can start thinking about sharing a common wireless system. One advantage or one goal that we wanted to do is to deploy our own wireless network. Can we move away from cell companies, which can lock us into expensive cellular contracts, and which have certain data routing schemes, which might expose it to the open internet. Next slide. Before I jump into some of the details, I just wanted to talk a little bit through the data flow of how we get sensor data online. And each one of these components we could probably spend a whole webinar talking about, but at its basics, how do you take sensor data? You need a microprocessor to process that sensor data and then to format it and communicate it with your radio module on the right hand side. And the radio module and the gateway kind of work hand in hand, where we're sending that data packet over a radio spectrum. Now that same concept works for cellular as well. It's a cell modem is just a radio modem. It's just using different frequencies and formats. And once our data is routed by either our cell tower or our own radio controlled gateway, it has to go to the internet somewhere. So it has to travel across our wide area network. We're using a wide area network for this application called the Things Network. And then your wide area network has to be able to direct it to your online application. I'm showing an example here from a company called Ubidots, which is an IoT company that provides easy dashboards for IoT data. So those two components on the right is where I'll be focusing most of the time here today. So can we have control over this wireless sensor network? Can we deploy our own sensors and really leave the cellular companies out of the loop and allow us to really push data across long distances and be able to work across organizational boundaries with this common technology backbone. Next slide. Again, I could talk quite a bit more about different sensors and sort of that microprocessor component. There's been a lot of IoT investments made in making microprocessors smaller and more power efficient. What I'm showing here is an implementation that we have of an Arduino-based data logging system called EnviroDIY. And then in the upper left image is a retrofit piece of equipment that can retrofit any Campbell or storm data logger type system with a low power long range system. So I won't go too much into detail here, but just know that there's thousands of different implementations of these sensors and microprocessors that really push the boundaries of what's available on the market today. So next slide. Moving back to the wireless side, if we think about how to get environmental data from the field back to the lab, we're mostly talking about this greater than 100 meters, greater than a kilometer. And there's different trade names for these technologies. The ones that are low power, that are really applicable for field use, are either LoRa, which stands for long range. There's Sigfox, there's LTE-M, and NB-IoT, which those two on the right, those are really part of the cellular band. So you'd be having to sign up for a cellular contract in order to access something from Verizon or Sprint or AT&T. I'll be focusing more on the public and open implementations, in particular LoRa here. We also see there's higher speed protocols available. Because we're just sending small packets of data from the field, we're definitely okay with this LoRa spec, which is a lower speed specification. Next slide. If you look at the Things Network, this has been a something that we've implemented here at Limno Tech. So we've been using and participating in the Things Network, which is a community LoRaWAN system. It's you use it to add devices to it, which allow you to authenticate against gateways that are deployed in the field. And then your device's data can travel over the Things Network's sort of a wireless backbone, and then it makes its way to the application on that far right hand side. So I don't have time to sort of walk through some of the visualizations of how easy it is to use this system, but just know that you can buy an instrument, scan a QR code on it, and within seconds, data from there is flowing to a nearby gateway, and it's flowing to an application online on your computer. Below this solid line here, we can see that the Things Network has many different implementations available. We're using what's called the Public Community Network, which is free and open and scales as the community is able to support servers and gateway installations. Next slide. So jumping through some of those technology hoops I'm talking about, you know, how do we actually start implementing this wireless sensor network? So I took an example of a buoy that we have deployed 8 miles off of Cleveland right now. And Limno Tech owns this buoy. We have a cell modem on it right now. It's sending environmental data over cellular, and primarily to monitor hypoxic conditions for the city of Cleveland's water treatment plant. You can see their water intake in the background. So what we're going to be doing this summer is installing a LoRa gateway station on the roof of the federal building in Cleveland. And I marked the roof of the federal building there on the left. And we're working with the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory on the installation of a low power gateway and antenna. And that antenna is going to be able to receive data from not only our buoy here, but from any sensor deployed within the listening range of this gateway station, which for Cleveland, it's about 20 miles. So for about a 20-mile radius, we can use one gateway to aggregate environmental data back and put it on the internet. Next slide. So if we take this example of what we're doing in Cleveland, we're also have already done this in Sandusky as well. And we're going to be doing this in Toledo this summer. I also pointed out on this map the gateway that we have installed at our Ann Arbor office. And we're also working with partners to get a complementary system installed on the Huron-Erie corridor system as well. And you know, so the goal here is to blanket areas of the Great Lakes with a LoRa network that we can aggregate sensor data with and really share this technology backbone in you know, various either research capacities or use of real-time data to inform an early warning system. So these are the theoretical coverage areas of these. If anyone wants to learn more about how to take advantage of these particular gateways, please feel free to reach out. Next slide. The advantages of this new wireless network: low power. I didn't talk about it too much, but we can deploy a new sensor that could last for 5 years on a single 2D cell batteries, and it can transmit data every 10 minutes for a year. We can transmit that data over a 10-mile range. These systems are scalable. They're also open access, so anyone can add devices. It's secure, and it's also low cost. So again, we could deploy a whole set of additional sensors. We're not going to incur any additional wireless costs, and we'll be able to use this common technology backbone. Next slide. Just the case study. So if we look at what we were doing over in Cleveland, and if we look a little bit closer in Toledo, we can see that there's between the University of Toledo, the NOAA Gluro Lab, and the city of Toledo and the city of Oregon, we have a density of stations to be able to share this common technology backbone. So we can blanket this entire Maumee Bay area, including the Toledo and Maumee River AOC, with the wireless sensor network, and really lower the cost to get environmental sensor data online. Next slide. One example is we can also blanket. Savannah, if you just want to click through and get all the stuff on there, is we can add this same dense sensor network to an agricultural watershed. We're installing online nutrient sensors, which sort of leads into our next talk. And we're also installing some smart soil moisture sensors and water level sensors in some select watersheds in Ohio. So the thing that's really brings all this sensor data together in real time is this low power, low cost wireless sensor network. Next slide, I think. Yeah, so just quickly on how to get involved. Folks can support hosting a gateway station. So it's being, if you live or have a university or a research building, being able to support a gateway really helps folks that want to put new sensors within listening distance, and we can start moving away from cellular contracts. There's hundreds of devices available. I just listed mydevices.com, has some good examples of some devices you can buy on a credit card and start playing with this technology. And we're also looking for researchers. Once we've lowered the limit on wireless sensor networks and how do we get data online, we're really trying to find researchers to come up with hypotheses that are more mesh sensor based. Can we monitor 10 locations instead of 1? Can we put out a swarm of HAB sensors instead of trying to be out there when there's a bloom going on with a boater, for example? So, and I think next slide. And that was it. So again, thanks everyone for listening about some of the new wireless sensor projects that we're working on right now. And I look forward to hearing any questions back. And I'll turn it over to Vince Kelly right now to jump into online nutrient sensing.
Thanks, Ed. I'm Vince Kelly from Green Eyes. I'd like to thank the Cleveland Water Alliance for inviting me to participate in the technology spotlight, and Ed and Alicia, my other friends at Limno Tech, who I've been working with for a while to get our technology out into the field. Specifically, the instruments that Green Eyes manufactures and sells are autonomous nutrient monitors for the measurement of nitrate, nitrite, soluble reactive phosphorus, ammonium, and silicate. Next slide, please. So nutrient pollution is well known, certainly beyond the Great Lakes region. It's a nationwide problem, a global problem. Green Eyes has many instruments deployed in China and agents in Qingdao, where this person chose a very interesting place to take a swim. But nutrient enrichment is a big problem. There's lots of sources, including agriculture, wastewater, aquaculture, and in fact, Green Eyes just had our first deployment in an aquaculture facility. It's a closed loop facility, but my message is just that we're getting our instruments out into different locations and different applications. Next slide, please. So while the problem with nutrient enrichment has really become catastrophic with environmental concerns, economic problems, and human health problems as well. So governments and environmental groups are spending a lot of money and effort to reduce nutrient inputs into receiving waters. One of the challenges is, however, that nutrient concentrations vary on short timescales and different timescales, including hourly if it's a coastal, tidally influenced area, if it's something driven by the sun or photosynthetic behavior. So we have diel timescales and rain and wind events on 3 to 5 days, and then hurricanes and other larger scale events. And traditional monitoring programs struggle to resolve these changes because the timescales are very different. Traditionally, we would send people out into the field to collect hand samples on either monthly or bi-weekly schedules. And of course, they often miss many of the significant rain or weather events because we don't want to go out in the field then. A lot of ISCO samplers deployed lately, but they have a limited number of samples that they can collect. And both methods have questions with sample preservation and degradation. So to really evaluate if we're having progress in this effort to reduce nutrient inputs into natural waters, we're going to need high frequency, high accuracy data. Next slide, please. Green Eyes offers the NuLab here seen on the right, wet chemical sensor. Benefits of these autonomous sensors are their high frequency, so data can be collected hourly or sub-hourly even. They use established wet chemical methods, the same methods that are used in the laboratories to measure nutrients, and which are very specific, so we know what we're measuring, and we can tell the difference between a signal from turbidity and CDOM and nutrients. They're very sensitive, as well as they can be scaled for high concentrations. The accuracy has been validated many times, and we always encourage users to continue to collect comparison samples to evaluate the method and make sure we're not making any mistakes. And of course, autonomous instruments eliminate the need for sample preservation because the analysis is done immediately after collection. And then following with Ed's talk, the data, when the instruments are put into these networks, the data is available on the internet in real time, and it's actionable. So we can trigger other field sampling events or perhaps ISCO samplers. Next slide, please. So I've been in the working with autonomous nutrient monitors for 20 years now. And since then, there are more commercial offerings available than there originally were. Many of you folks have probably heard of Seabird Scientific's cycle P phosphate sensor. These are all wet chemical instruments. This is a submersible unit. An Italian company, Sistia, offers the Whiz probe. It's multi-channel submersible wet chemical sensor. Al Hansen at Rhode Island developed the SubChemPack some years ago. It's actually a profiling device, so it could been deployed on CTDs to record data continuously on a profile, vertical profile. Next slide, please. And Green Eyes offers now 3 different varieties of our NuLab. These are all wet chemical instruments. You might have seen from the previous slide, the reagents and standards and washing solutions are stored in like a hospital IV bag and hung either above or next to the instrument. They use a syringe pump where the reagents and standards and washing solutions are connected to a rotary valve. So the valve moves to a sample port, draws in water, adds color-forming reagent, mixes it up at the detector port inside the syringe, injects the reacted sample into the syringe, and the detector measures light attenuation. What's nice about the NuLab is all the actions of the valve, syringe, and detector are controlled by simple text files that we can upload easily. So if we would like to change the amount of mixing that the instrument does, or perhaps a dilution scheme to get higher concentrations on scale, we just have to change a text file, upload it, and then run that, and we can do that without changing any hardware. We have added a real-time touchscreen controller to NuLabs, where the data is collected and processed in real time, can be posted on the web in real time in both text and plot formats. This instrument also can be equipped with relays and toggle switches so that we can control pumps and valves as well as additional devices. Last year, we developed NuLab Buoy, which is the same analytical hardware in a different format so that this instrument can be submerged down to 10 meters for buoy deployments. Next slide, please. We actually just deployed our prototype total nitrogen and total phosphorus instrument this morning, collected our very first data point today, just about an hour ago. And this instrument uses the same type of syringe pump detector architecture. We have a digestion channel that uses persulfate digestion to digest total nitrogen and phosphorus to nitrate and phosphate. And we're also coming out with a more modular system, the single channel NuLab, where reagents will be contained in small boxes, and they can be hung on the instrument or on top, sort of like a saddle, and some of the connections will be made a little bit easier. And so the idea for this is to follow what many monitoring groups do with data sondes, where they swap out a sonde in the field and just replace it with another one, so that the time in the field is reduced and the instrument has already been calibrated and checked out. So less time in the field, higher data returns. Next slide, please. In fall of 2017, we were able to participate in the Internet of H2O monitoring competition sponsored by the Cleveland Water Alliance, Digital Sea, and US Ignite. Our group was fortunate enough to win that competition based pretty much upon the data here in the slide, where the high frequency small round dots are, the green is nitrate and the red is SRP. And the squares were hand samples collected by a ISCO sampler run by Heidelberg University. And this was a particularly nice deployment because we had a hand sample to compare with every day. And so what you see is these squares and the data run by Heidelberg compared quite nicely with the data from the NuLab. We have done several of these comparisons over the years, and generally they look quite good, but we always encourage our users to collect hand samples whenever possible to make sure we're on top of things. Alicia Ritzenthaler is going to follow me. Alicia from Limno Tech. She's going to present some more data from the field. Next slide, please. Yeah. Thank you, Savannah. Yeah, so again, thanks to the Cleveland Water Alliance and Limno Tech for allowing me to join the webinar. If anyone has any questions specific to NuLabs or nutrient monitoring, please just email me, vince@gescience.com, and then I'll hand it over to Alicia Ritzenthaler from Limno Tech. Thank you.
Great. Since Ed set up who LimnoTech is and what we work on, and since Vince gave a nice introduction to what the NuLab instruments are, I'm just going to jump in with some case studies that LimnoTech has been involved in the Great Lakes. You can move to the next slide. So the first case study that I want to talk about was a deployment that we did in Green Bay, Wisconsin. We had a deployment on the Fox River right near the mouth of the river before it emptied out into the bay. We deployed this NuLab in conjunction with an existing USGS monitoring station. So you can see in the pictures on the bottom right, that is the USGS station that is sitting already on the shore. And so we installed a 2-channel nitrate phosphate NuLab inside the station. So we utilized their existing power and the pumps that they already have running and set this deployment up to be sampling every 2 hours. And so the goal of this deployment was to be able to see if we could track nutrient loads during rainfall events. So you can move to the next slide. So I'm just going to show a little bit of data for each of these. We don't have too much time to get into the weeds here. But what's exciting about this deployment is in sort of right before April 23rd on the left-hand side of these graphs, you can see where discharge and gauge height are rising in the river. And so they're not rising dramatically, but we do see that first flush of nitrate coming in at that event. And then later, around the beginning of May, we do see a more dramatic event in terms of discharge and gauge height, but we just see a little bit more of an increase in the signal. So we are seeing where nutrients could be tracking with runoff from these rainfall events. You can move to the next slide. The second case that I want to talk about is a deployment that we did in Sandusky. This happened the last couple of summers. We'll be deploying it again this summer in 2020. This deployment was in Sandusky Bay. We secured this NuLab underneath the Edison Bridge, so it was over water. That lower right-hand picture, you can see the instrument. It's housed in that small box on the left. And then we had this one running on solar power, and it had an integrated intake pump that was specific to this instrument. So like Vince mentioned, we coupled this instrument with relays to trigger when that pump should turn on and off based on our sampling schedule, so that all of the water that we were sampling was in fact like fresh current water, not water that had been like trapped in the system. You can move to the next slide. So for this deployment, we were looking specifically at connections there may be between phosphorus load and sediment resuspension. So I have just our phosphate data for a short period of time, as well as some turbidity data. So we also had a turbidity sonde deployed at this location as well, which is how we're able to put these side by side. And what we see is that the phosphate does track with the turbidity really well. They're on slightly different timescales here, so we have turbidity being collected at like 10-minute intervals and phosphate being collected at 2-hour intervals. But we do see, let's say at like October 16th, where phosphate and turbidity are both very low, and then immediately after that, there was some sort of event that caused both turbidity and phosphate to rise. You can move to the next slide. The last deployment that I'm going to talk about was a deployment that we did offshore in Toledo. So unlike the other two deployments that I just spoke about, this one was located distinctly offshore. So this NuLab was monitoring nitrate, phosphate, and ammonia, and we had it located at a servicing station for intake pumps. And so this deployment was sort of like the hybrid between the last two deployment setups, where we had facility power, facility pumps, but we're deploying this sort of like an inside of a structure that was already existing. So next slide. For here, we were sort of looking at nutrient dynamics, sort of spring to fall, how they might change. So what we see is that the top panel here is an indicator of blue-green algae. The bottom two panels are nitrate and phosphate. So we can see at the beginning of the season, the nutrients were both like pretty high, very distinguishable, while the blue-green algae was quite low. And then just at the end of July, the very beginning of August, we see where nitrate drops off significantly right at the time where the blue-green algae is increasing. And so from there on, the rest of the season, the nutrients stay low while the algal count is high. And then right at the sort of in late September, while the algae is tapering off, we see the nutrients rising up again. You can move to the next slide. So I realize that those 3 case studies were extremely quick, but hopefully that gives you some sense of what you can do with these instruments in the field. Some other opportunities that we are looking towards using these instruments for in the future that your organizations might also be interested in is monitoring phosphorus removal at treatment wetlands, at the edge of tiles, and anaerobic digester systems. What we're finding is they're also well suited for easy removal and setup for rotating watershed studies. We can collect really high intensity data at the watershed level and also pair them with other high frequency measurements. So as Vince and Ed both alluded to, we have 3 new instruments going out in the Maumee River this summer that will be monitoring total phosphate and total nitrate, or total nitrogen and total phosphorus, excuse me, to target some of these more watershed-based studies. Next slide. So with that, thank you. If you have questions, please send a chat. We'll have some time to answer them at the end. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to John at ECO so that he can share.
Great. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm John. So this is going to be a little bit different. We're going to be mostly talking about invasive species, not so much on the toxic algae front, though we certainly could go into harmful algae down the road. We just haven't gone into that area yet. So, and on top of that, most of this is going to be in Texas because we're actually based in Austin, Texas, and we're doing some work with invasive and endangered species. So let's go ahead to the next slide. So yeah, this is kind of our general vision statement, blah, 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 corporate stuff. Basically, the idea is we're trying to create balanced, long-term, sustainable ecosystems. This picture was actually taken in the field. It's quite beautiful out there. Next slide, please. So we're going to be talking about a lot of environmental DNA stuff here today, and also environmental RNA. And the kind of the dividing line that we really want to get at is that there's been a big push right now for environmental DNA. So that last slide that we kind of split by really quickly was us in the field, and we're actually looking at environmental DNA there in groundwater systems. And the reason why we're doing that is because environmental DNA actually sticks around in the environment a lot longer than people previously anticipated. And we're in that slide where we were looking at the, can you go back one slide, please? Yeah, so right here, these springs are kind of near a lake that has a zebra mussel infestation, and their concern is that the surface water is leaking into the groundwater supply, which is a big issue with water rights in Texas. So they were using environmental DNA of zebra mussels as a tracer. What this should kind of get your hackles up with is, well, then if you get an environmental DNA hit, how the heck do you know if it's actually a population, whether it exists or not? And the answer is you don't. Typically, DNA sticks around for a lot longer than we anticipated, and so it can even be found in these groundwater systems, and clearly there are no zebra mussels living in karst springs. So this is kind of to just let you guys understand the gravity of this. Next slide, please. So just in general, I recommend anybody check out this paper. It does a really good job of breaking down what environmental DNA is, and it also goes the same for environmental RNA. Today, what we kind of focus on as a company is what's circled here, the particulate matter, or intramembranous and extramembranous. That means inside the cell, just outside the cell, and associated with just random particles. The free dissolved stuff is so varied, and you can't really get a good representative sample doing that we found. So we kind of focus on these areas instead. Next slide, please. So for those of you guys not familiar, we'll kind of go back to our Bio 301 course, right? So the central dogma of biology is that DNA codes for RNA. RNA is kind of the, if you think of DNA as the blueprint, RNA is the guy running the message over to the contractor, and the protein is the actual finished product. So the messenger RNA, the mRNA, it breaks down very quickly. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just kind of how this works chemically is that DNA is a very stable molecule. It's a double helix. It doesn't break down very quickly. Whereas RNA, it's kind of made to break down quickly, right? It's a transient molecule. So while RNA sticks around for a very long time, RNA does not, which allows us to kind of see, if we see RNA, we can actually see life. But other than that, since RNA is the actual message of what the DNA is, basically of what the organism is doing, it's like we can intercept that message. You know, if you think back to, like, you know, World War II and all that, we're intercepting that message so we know what the system is actually doing. So not only does environmental RNA allow us to determine if something is alive or dead, it also lets us to determine other things about the population. Like, is it spawning? Is it about to spawn? Is it experiencing stress? What kind of stress is it experiencing? All of those questions can be determined if you query which genes are turned on and off in a way that's strategic. So this is kind of where we're trying to go, is to get some real-time information that's actually useful. Anybody who's worked with environmental DNA knows that this can be a bit of a hassle. Also, I forgot to give my background in the beginning. My background is actually in biopharmaceutical development. I worked in oncology for a long time in early stage cancer diagnostics and smart drug applications. And this is kind of basically all around the stuff that we do for tumor characterization and early stage cancer detection. That's kind of what the backbone of this technology that we're doing is. So, okay, next slide, please. So we also have these automated, so essentially how we operate, and we have these, there you go. We have these automated sampling platforms that get put out at points of interest. This is at a dam in central Texas, and they're concerned about zebra mussels. So we basically, this thing automatically collects and preserves, and we have a kind of a proprietary preservative buffer that stops the breakdown of that environmental RNA that we utilize to kind of take a snapshot of what's going on. And I'll kind of go through how this thing works. It's kind of, this was our prototype. Our new ones look much better. Next slide, please. So inside, you've got a series of these filter packs. They have a 80 micron, 36 micron filter. Remember, we're looking at particulate matter primarily, so we don't really care about that 1.4 micron stuff. Plus, on top of that, the housing of this, the plastic that we use, actually binds any free and dissolved anyway, so we're grabbing all of it regardless. And this allows us to go to much higher flow rates. Currently, when you grab an eDNA sample, you're looking at maybe a liter, and we have in more turbid waters, and that gets clogged. We typically, even in turbid waters, will filter 2,000 liters. It gives us a more representative sample, and it gives us a better signal. Next slide, please. And in general, what we're trying to provide is a decision tree. So this kind of breaks down how we like to advise our clients on what decisions to, how to make their decision. We call this eco-DX or eco-diagnostics. And ultimately what we're providing is an executive summary, a color-coded monitoring map of where you're having problems. And we constantly update with more technical level updates with, you know, the actual raw values and all that stuff. But really, we've seen a lot of our clients, they just want actionable information. So kind of the executive line, top line summary, and the map are what we found to be most helpful. But all the other results are available as well. Next slide, please. So this was, as an example, this is environmental DNA stuff. And this is a lake in a state where I can't mention the state's name because it's actually reporting, there's some weird stuff around what you can and can't report out in that state. So what's interesting here is that this looks like, from the data, that they have a pretty heavy infestation of quagga mussel. They do not. This is a completely well-managed lake. There have been divers that go down here frequently. For this study, this was actually our negative control lake. And we know that they don't have it. Every boat that goes in is checked. Every boat that comes out, you know, it's checked and deconned before they go in the water, and when they come out of the water, they're checked and deconned as well. And they send down divers periodically to check for that kind of stuff, and they're testing for veligers on a monthly basis, if not, it may be even more frequently than that. But so why are we getting these environmental DNA spikes? Well, there's really only two marinas here, and they're at where the red dot is and where the orange dot is. And they have those decon stations where they're hosing down the boats with high pressure wash and hot pressure wash before the boats go in. So they're basically just flushing all this environmental DNA of the dead stuff into the water. So what's really happening is their decon steps work really, really well. But if you were just to look at environmental DNA, this thing looks infested. We went back and queried the same lake, well, with the exact same samples. We queried those for environmental RNA. We saw zero life at all, no indications of life whatsoever. So anyway, next slide. It's just as one example. This was a study that Parks and Wildlife here in Texas had us do. They had a lake, this is Lake Waco. So this is outside of Waco, Texas, you know, Branch Davidians, all that kind of stuff. It's between Austin and Dallas. Essentially what happened here is there's a lake nearby that has a zebra mussel infestation called Lake Belton. And so Lake Belton, there was a group from some people doing some work on the marinas had taken their barge out of Lake Belton, came down to work on the marina in Lake Waco. And when they were pulling the barge out, it capsized and they noticed that the entire underside was coated in zebra mussels. So then they moved really quickly and they tarped off the area where the marina was to lower dissolved oxygen content, try and get rid of that. The problem is Parks has been sampling this lake ever since that happened, and they never see veligers, but they always get DNA hits. And so they wanted to put their resources elsewhere because in Texas, we don't really spend a lot of money on our parks department, so it's very limited resources. So this is what our DNA told us. There's some level, yes, we're getting some hits and whatnot. But we, again, saw no RNA. And next slide, please. Yeah, so this is kind of where we saw the most DNA. And oddly enough, this yellow bit over here, that's where the marina is. This is another boat ramp, and so these boat ramps over here are lesser used because, well, they're not as used as this one, but this is where the college kids like to come in and out more. It's cheaper fees for the parks down here. And so this was right after Memorial Day weekend. So we got big DNA hits where all the college kids had just shown up and they weren't very good boaters. But we didn't see any actual active infestation, which was a good sign. So this lake is in the midst of being delisted. However, all the signage for the clean, drain, dry signage is over here towards the, can you guys see my cursor, by the way? No, you can't, that's right. So over by on the east end where it's closer to the city, that yellow dot is actually where all the signage for clean, drain, dry is. The red and the orange dots, not so much. So now they're putting in some additional signage and trying to delist this. Next slide, please. This is the RNA expression. As you notice, there is nothing. There is no RNA expression. Next slide. This is a different case study. So this is a place, this is kind of near Texas A&M. And it's a lake where they had again seen DNA. They never saw any veligers. So this is our DNA data. Okay, we've got some DNA. Next slide. But oh, look at this. We have some RNA popping up in a small amount in a site where they weren't actually looking where they thought it might be. Next slide, please. So if you'll notice this red dot, that's where they found a small amount of RNA that was based on metabolic activity. This showed a small scale live infestation. The orange one, again, this was all around Memorial Day weekend, so not, there was a ton of activity anyway. The other one was so low that it was below our limit of detection, likely something that was still there, but not an active population. We went back in here with divers. Sure enough, where that red dot is, there was a very small, blink if you miss it, early stage population. So they went down, they put down some tarps, treated it. We went back and verified that they got rid of the infestation here before it actually took over the lake. Next slide, please. So, and then just that auto sampler, we've been monitoring this over time. And this is target DNA. We've never found RNA here, but it's of a high concern to us. So this was a pilot study that we did. That's now completed, and we're just starting to launch those auto samplers for commercial service contracts. Next slide, please. And this is kind of the cool new thing we're working on. So National Science Foundation and Bureau of Reclamation they gave us some grants to go after a way to actually get rid of quagga mussels in a sustainable, environmentally friendly fashion. So what we've done is we have a targeting domain that has been developed jointly between us and Bureau of Reclamation that is specific only for dry cynids, so quagga and zebra mussels. And then we have a toxin backbone that we've removed its normal targeting domain, and we've bioengineered those together and are utilizing that as kind of a smart drug approach. So on the left, we've also, on these pictures, we added in a fluorescent tag to it so that we could visualize where it is. So on the left, you see a quagga mussel veliger where we've turned off the enzymatic activity. and we just want to look at binding. And sure enough, it's binding internal structures. It's going exactly where we want it to go inside of the quagga muscle veliger. On the right, this is one where we did not turn off the enzymatic structure. So this is one where we have active death going on. This guy's falling apart. This is quagga muscle protein up here, and you can still see some of our stuff onto it. And essentially, it seems to be working. This won't be available, and we'll be able to start doing limited in-water testing at the end of this year, or at least set up those contracts at the end of this year once we finish where we are in the grant right now. But that's the next big thing that we're working on. And of course, then we could do constant monitoring to make sure that the infestation doesn't come back. I just got these images last week, so I was excited to throw them into the presentation today. Next slide, please. Okay, I always like to end on a joke, and I tried to go quickly enough, but I talked so darn much, I don't think I did. So again, DNA, haha, very funny. Anyway, I'm happy to take any questions. My email is john.higley@eqo.life, and I really want to thank Ed at Limno Tech and for having me. We met not too long ago, and it's already been a wonderful, awesome partnership. Limno Tech is a wonderful group, and I'm really excited to be part of this and meet all of you. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, John. It looks like we've just got a couple minutes left for questions. There aren't a lot of questions in the docket, so if you have a question, please send it in. I know that our panelists have been going through and answering some questions. Some of the one that came up quite a few times is if the presentation will be available. And yes, we're recording it and we'll send out a link afterwards. And I think that might be it for the hour. So unless panelists, do you have any last parting words? All right, I'm going to take that as a no. Well, thank you everyone for coming. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us and we'll send out a link, hopefully later this afternoon with the recording link. And thanks for coming, and thanks to all of our great panelists. And everyone have a great day.